Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I hope it finds you well. Welcome to John's Writing Space. My name is John, and I am an author. And I'm coming to you here today on another Storytime Thursday to read Chapter 10 of my first book, The Shadow of the Past, the chapter entitled Politics and Plots. Please take a moment to like, share, subscribe. After this, I'd love to hear your comments and thoughts about my reading as well as the content of the chapter. So buckle in here. Chapter 10, Politics and Plots. It was several hours before dawn, and Lady Myra at House Patrol was leaning against the wall of a small alley in the Horland district, one of the dingier sections of Gaerudar. She was no longer wearing armor or carrying a spear. She had exchanged these for a simple yet elegant blue shirt and a dark cloak. She carried only a large knife in the back of her belt. She hoped that her contact would arrive soon because she was getting tired. She had been awake for nearly 2 whole days, and they had been busy. It had taken her almost a full day to track down the elf, and she had hurried him and the goblin he was with back to her family's house in the early hours of the morning. She was playing a dangerous game. She was well aware that as a member of the Union, officially, she was bound to turn the elf and his companion over to them, as they had ordered be done. She had long been suspicious of the Union's motives, but a mere day ago she would never have dreamed that she would now be seeking a way to separate Ramalda from them. It was not only the events of the past days that had tired her out, however. During her several-hour-long interrogation, she had tried to delve into the elf's mind, an ability any with magical abilities could learn, yet rather than seeing his mind, he had looked into hers. It felt like she had been stripped bare and hollowed out, and even though it had only lasted a few seconds, it had exhausted her more than days of staying awake ever could. Rather than finding out what plans the elf had for the Union and then turning him over, she had been persuaded that the Union must be removed from Ramalda with all haste before their control became total, a concern she certainly shared. When Ramalda joined the Union, it had seemed promising. Mutual protection and trade at immediate appeal, and an end to centuries of hostilities brought a welcome change. But in the 5 years since, they were slowly winning more and more concessions of power away from the Nobles' Council. Her father and several other nobles were working to return power back to the council, but they were slowly losing ground to the rest of the council, who believed that there were more opportunities to advance their own ambitions by supporting the Union. She herself had been working for about a year to find some kind of proof of what exactly the Union was trying to do. It was quite a big jump for her, however, to be actively looking for a way to remove them from Romualda for good. As if in answer to her new desire, one of her agents had brought word that a servant of one of the chief nobles allied with the Union was willing to give them important information. The elf, and especially his goblin companion, had been suspicious at the timing of this fortuitous aid, but Myra had insisted upon going to meet this contact herself. She had gotten there early and had been waiting for nearly a half an hour. The contact was now running late, but she decided to wait a little longer before returning to House Patrol. Myra had just about made up her mind to leave when she heard footsteps approaching her from the next street. She took several steps towards the noise before she realized that it was a whole troop of boots that she heard. She had just started to look for some way to hide when, all of a sudden, she felt an arm grab hold of her waist and a hand close over her mouth. Her assailant pulled her back against the alley wall, and as the footsteps came around the corner, she felt a sense of some spell coming over her. She was shocked to see that it was not a watch patroller laborers that came around the corner, but a dozen soldiers bearing the crest of House Durton. The soldiers searched the alley very carefully, and as they turned to leave, Myra heard their leader say, "Damnation! We were told that the Duke's daughter would be here. What is Magister Horthal playing at, sending us here on a fool's errand?" With that, the soldiers stormed off in the direction of the Durton mansion at the North Docks. As the soldiers turned the corner out of sight, Myra began to struggle free from her assailant. As soon as she began to struggle, her assailant released her and she turned to strike, but she stopped her blow short when she realized that she was standing face to face with the elf. Valinar, what are you doing out here? How did you get past my guards? You haven't killed them, have you? Your guards are unharmed, Lady Myra, replied Valinar. In fact, they are still under the impression that I am in the room you left us in. Then how? I got out of the room in the same way I hid us both from those soldiers. You made us you made us invisible. Not invisible, unnoticed. If any of those soldiers had been skilled in what you call magic, or even if they had merely been looking closely enough at us, they would have found us. Why were you following me in the first place? As Urgur told you when your agent brought you information about the meaning, he felt that it was a trap. And when you would not listen to him, I felt that it was best that I followed you in case he was right. And it looks like it was a good thing that I did. Myra only half heard what Valinar said, and she stared in puzzlement as the elf slowly stooped down as if investigating something that was lying in the alley. She was about to ask what he was doing when she noticed that he had picked up a small stone which lay by his foot. He stood up with sudden speed and threw the stone at the roof of the building behind Myra. She heard an audible smack as the stone made contact with something, and the yelp that followed told her that it had hit a person. She looked up to see a hooded figure turn and run away along the rooftops down the alley. Get after him, snapped Valinar in a hurried whisper as he ran towards the building the figure had been standing on top of. He began to swiftly climb the building, although Myra could not see how even his nimble fingers gained purchase upon the stonework. With no further thought, she turned and sprinted down the alley after the cloaked figure. It ran along the edge of the rooftops, leaping between the narrow gaps of buildings. By the way it was holding its right arm, the stone had done damage. Myra was having difficulty keeping pace with the figure, but a quick glance told her that the elf was swiftly gaining. The figure clearly seemed to have noticed too, and as the alley narrowed, the man, for she could clearly see that the figure had the build of a man now, made a daring jump across the alley. Valinar clearly saw the move, for he jumped from the building almost in tandem with the man and caught him around the waist in midair, and they both landed on the rooftop of the opposite building with a crash and quickly rolled out of sight. Myra stopped running and, after a moment's concentration, muttered a few words, and then an almost spectral rope dangled from the roof of the building, which she quickly climbed. When she reached the top, she undid her spell so that none could follow her. She looked up to see Valinar and the cloaked man grappling with each other. The man held a knife and was making wide slashes at the elf, who dodged them deftly. Seeing this, she raised her hand and began to mutter the incantation of a simple fire spell to deal with the figure. Sensing what she was doing, Valinar's eyes flashed in her direction, and she felt her spell undone before she had even completed it. We need him alive for questioning, hissed the elf, and fire would attract attention. Myra sighed and reluctantly lowered her hand. She had to admit his reasoning was excellent, but she was annoyed at being challenged. Seeing the elf momentarily distracted, the man made a lunging thrust at Valinar, who easily caught the man's hand and twisted the dagger from it. This was followed by a snake-fast blow with the heel of his hand, which lifted the man off his feet and sent him sprawling to the ground. The man, clearly shocked at the elf's strength, made to rise, but the elf held up his hand. He struggled but could not rise. He attempted to call for help, but his voice was stopped dead before it left his throat. He is yours to question, my lady, stated the elf, especially since I do believe that this is your agent who set us up this morning. It seems he came to see his betrayal firsthand. Surprised, Myra moved forward swiftly and knelt down beside the man and removed his hood. She started visibly as she saw that the man was indeed Lons Havor. As the dull brown eyes of her best agent stared up at her in anger, she was momentarily at a loss to think of what she should ask this traitor of a man. Finally, she settled on the question she wanted to know the most. Why? Why? Chortled the man indignantly. Because the Union is going to win. Because your father will soon lose his position, but mostly because they gave me a better offer. So that's it then, is it? Myra spat. 10 years of loyal service to my family, and you turn just like that? I should kill you right now. And why don't you? Replied Lons with a sneer. Perhaps you can have your pet elf do it. No, you are going to answer some questions first, and then I might consider your request, came Myra's cold reply. "Then ask all the questions you want, but I will answer none of them," laughed the man, who seemed to be taking his captor lightly. "Lord Durton will have me freed before you get me to your interrogation rooms." "What makes you think I'm going to wait before asking you questions?" replied Myra with a smile. "Why does Lord Durton want me captured?" Lons glared at her defiantly, as if he was daring her to try and torture information out of him. Their eyes met, and there was a moment's pause as they matched wills before the man finally said with some effort, "Lord Durton says you are an enemy, and that you could ruin everything. Too dangerous to be left free, especially with the elf and goblin helping you." Myra released him from her gaze and sat back heavily. She was already tired, and just getting him to tell her that much had taken most of her strength. "We don't have time for this," said Valinar, breaking the silence. "I can already hear footsteps there approaching. They are no doubt looking for us." And with that, he walked forward and grabbed the man roughly by his shirt, forcing him to look in his eyes. Their eyes seemed to only be connected for a second or two, but the man's head suddenly fell to the floor, and his eyes snapped shut, and his breathing came slowly. Valinar merely blinked and rubbed his temple. "Well," began Myra before she was cut off by Valinar. "Not here," said Valinar, to which he added, after seeing the angry expression come into her face, "I swear that I will explain everything, but not here. Durton soldiers will soon surround us." With that, both Valinar and Myra left the roof of the building and carefully made their way back to the stately house patrol overlooking the Bay of Derlan. Since they had to move slowly to stay undetected, the city was beginning to awake before Myra made it back to her house. Other than the general plan of discrediting her father and forcing him to turn over the title of Duke to Lord Durton, there was little Valinar had learned from Lons. It seems that even this was overheard by Lons, who was probably trying to play both sides for his own benefit. The only useful information was that Magister Horthal had Lords Durton, Emil, Jorth, Kang, Porthon, Bers, and Minir on his side, having won them over with the promise of vast riches from the trade of the Union could open. This was troubling because it meant that the Union now had a majority on the Nobles' Council, and it was only her father's title of Duke and the support of the army and navy that came with it that kept the Union in check. Myra reflected on this as she lay in her bed trying to catch a few hours of sleep before she was awakened by the business of the day. Valinar had snuck back into his cell to prevent questions from being asked when the morning meal was brought. She wished that she knew what the elf was thinking, because she was at a loss to think of a way that she could prevent Ramalda from falling totally into the hands of the Union. If only she could think of something. It could only have been a few hours later, judging by the position of the sun peering through her bedroom window, when one of the house servants knocked gently upon her door, summoning her to her father. She arose from her bed and moved towards the armor which she was accustomed to wear, which was piled on the floor. As she reached for it, she hesitated and thought better of it. She turned and moved towards her wardrobe and selected a robe of a magister, a deep sea green matching the color of her eyes, which went all the way to her ankles and had short sleeves. She bound her waist with a belt of thin leather, in which she placed a small dagger in an ornamental sheath, and about her neck she clasped a pendant, sapphire on a fine gold chain. Finally, as she bound her hair in a simple ponytail with a silver clasp, she looked at herself in the wardrobe's mirror. She was, as always when she wore such garments, aware of how vulnerable she was without her armor, but she reassured herself that her father was giving a public audience. It would be better for her to be Lady Myra the Magister rather than Lady Myra the Warrior. She swept quickly through the mansion, annoyed that her pace and strides were limited by the garment she had chosen to wear. Her father would be in the viewing room, so called because it overlooked the bay, and its tall windows allowed a clear view of all the comings and goings of Romalda's vast merchant fleets. The view was an impressive one, and it was small wonder that when the dukedom had passed to House Petrol some 300 years previously, that Verthine Petrol had chosen that room to place the ducal seat and hold council. Needing to compose herself before she faced her father, Lady Myra paused for a moment, just short of the room, before striding forward once more and signaled the waiting guard to open the room. She barely waited for the door to yawn wide enough to admit her, even her slender frame, before striding through it. As it was still morning and the viewing room faced west, the room was lit by glowing orbs set between each of the tall pillars of granite which made up the structure of the room. She judged the orbs to be about half their full brightness, which meant that her father was not holding a full council that day. The soft glow of the orbs was more than sufficient to light the great expanse of the room, aided by the clearness of the day, which had only recently dawned. But it had long been tradition that when council was in session to have the orbs at their full brightness. This was in the belief, a millennia old at least, that it was harder to be dishonest when every crease and line and movement of the face was visible under the glaring scrutiny of those magical orbs. If anything, Lady Myra thought to herself, the current situation proves that while the idea was good in theory, it failed to hold up in practice. Sitting in the chair that had for time out of mind been the traditional seat of the Dukes of Ramalda was her father, a short, thin, and balding man well into his sixth decade, who seemed dwarfed by the great chair on which he sat, which was fashioned of a single piece of emerald green granite and expertly carved with reliefs of waves crashing upon the shore. The stark white of the orbs revealed every gray hair in his short beard and upon his head. He was dressed in a simple but rich doublet of deep blue, with his trousers of the same fabric but embroidered with silver on the sides. A fitted garment revealed that Duke Metan Patel was still a strong man, though age wore heavily on his features, and he wore the silver coronet of the Duke, with its lone emerald above his brow, with pride bringing his eyes into focus. As she was entering the chamber, two men whom she knew very well were leaving it. First was her uncle Ramar, her mother's elder brother, a man of average height and stocky build, wearing a blue tunic with a brown leather vest and silver trousers. Across his shoulder was a green sash bearing the markings of the Knight Commander of Ramalda, as well as his many decorations of valor and bravery during his long service. He inclined his head towards her, but said nothing, and strangely did not make eye contact. Second was her paternal uncle Gaerudar, wearing a long green robe and bearing in his right hand a tall staff of pine, carved with many waves and ships and various creatures of the sea, bearing a large green emerald upon the top set in the metal bracket. He too said nothing, but gave her a wide grin and winked at her. Lady Myra realized, watching them go with some puzzlement at their silence, that the Union would have had her father out months ago, if not years, with sheer force, had they not needed a legitimate excuse for the Romaldan military and the magisters to back them. Without it, her uncle's war record was such, especially his almost legendary victory against the Iltor pirate armada 20 years previously, that most of the military would follow him, and Guerrero was the most popular Lord Magister in nearly a century. As she was striding across the smooth stone floor towards her father, Myra noticed that standing between two guards on her left were Valinar and Urgar. Since neither were bound, Myra assumed that Valinar's absence the previous night had gone unnoticed by the guards, which she was grateful for. Her father was a reasonable man, but he would have been much displeased to hear that a prisoner had escaped from his cells with such ease. No, it was far better that such news come from her, although she could not imagine that he would be particularly happy with her sneaking out on her own to meet a contact. These thoughts had raced about Myra's mind several times in the brief time that it took her to cross the chamber to the chair of emerald waves. "Good morning to you, my father," beamed Myra, curtsying deeply before her father and flashing what Myra hoped was a fresh and energetic smile before rising to kiss him gently upon the cheek. "I am most glad to see that you are well this day." The Duke smiled at this and took his daughter's hands into his and seemed to examine them for a moment. "I, too, am glad to see that you are well this day, especially given the close call that you had last night at the hands of Durton's men." He sighed deeply before continuing. "Have I not told you time and again about going off on your own? You are my only daughter, and if Durton had captured you, who knows how he would have used you against me?" Upon hearing her father's words, Myra's eyes had shot open in surprise and guilt right up her throat, so that it took a moment for her to even try to respond. all while the grim smile never left her father's face. The Duke, however, was not done. And I understand that this elf is to thank for your safety, although I should perhaps be angry with him that he broke from his cell. Indeed, had not the report come to me that was seen returning with you, and had he not acknowledged his wrongdoing, professed having saved you from a trap, he would be suffering punishment for it at this moment. Myra's head shot around like a whip to stare agape at the expressionless elf. You told him, she stammered. I beg your forgiveness, my lady, responded the elf as his face slowly turned into a grim smile. I was brought into your father's presence at first light, and he confronted me with the fact that I had been out of my cell and seen in your company. I knew it was your wish to tell him yourself, but I saw no profit in keeping the information from him, especially since the success of my purpose here depends very much on your father's cooperation. Do not blame him, my dear, the Duke said in a firm tone. He did the right thing in telling me. His honesty and his rescue of you has earned him my trust, at least for the moment. You will help him, then? Inquired Myra, turning quickly back to her father, once more beaming her finest smile, in the hopes that he would allow the subject to be so quickly changed. Her father regarded her for what seemed like a long moment, his sea-green eyes almost boring into her, and then for an even longer moment he turned to regard Valinar and Urgar with the same expression. Myra noted that, unlike with her and Lons, Valinar did not match her father's stare, keeping his bright blue eyes focused out the window of the room. Once her father broke the stare, he sighed heavily before speaking. I do not deny that I have been uneasy about the Union from the first time they sent ambassadors to us about 15 years ago. I did not oppose the initial peace treaties between us, nor even our joining the Union, because I had no reason to, and had agreed that we stood much to gain, both in trade and from the ability to finally ease the defenses maintained since the storm wars on our eastern border. However, they have been taking more and more liberties with us and have been slowly bending us to their whim. I did not think that so many of our lords would be on their side, but it seems that I may have no choice but to soon relinquish my ducal title to the united force of the nobles' council and the Union. Father, please tell me that you're not considering simply giving up, interjected Myra with a strong note of fear quavering in her voice. Please say you're not. We cannot simply let them walk all over us. The Duke took his daughter's hand into his own once more and patted it in reassurance. After a long moment of looking at his daughter's hands, a smile broke upon his face and he chuckled softly. You have your mother's strength. No, child, I do not intend on simply giving up, but my hands are tied. As yet, Lord Durton has done nothing against the law, at least not overtly. Unless we can prove that he has tricked the other lords and is betraying us to the Union, I can take no action against him without making myself into a tyrant, which would alienate even our supporters. It seems clear that whatever this Durton would use to usurp your title will almost certainly be nothing but lies and misinformation, Urgar pointed out. Indeed, my good goblin, replied the Duke, but with that support he has, I will be forced to step aside immediately, so that by the time the truth comes out, it will be far, far too late to do anything about it. And with how bold Durton has become in trying to capture my daughter, he must be close, very close indeed, to playing his final move. Lady Myra looked thoughtfully for a moment at the mention of the events of the previous night, and a dawning realization took hold like the first direct rays of sun as it crossed the horizon. Some concrete proof must exist that Durton and the Union was worried that I would get my hands on. That is why they were so keen to capture me, for fear that some other agent of mine would bring the proof to my attention. We have proof, Valinar reminded her. The man who betrayed you provided us with it. Let us bring it before the meeting of our Lord's Council and reveal the Durton for the fraud he is. Urgar responded first. Valinar, my friend, that will not work. Why not? He was speaking the truth. I do not doubt you that this man was speaking the truth, said the Duke, smiling, but your goblin friend is correct. That will not work. The word of one demonstrably dishonest man will sway no one on the council, much less a dead dishonest man, and he will almost certainly die for his folly. The fact that this confession came from magical coercion by one who is a known opponent of the Union will be further strikes against our argument. Valinar's expression was stern for a moment upon hearing this, and reflecting he nodded grimly and said, I suppose you're right, and it follows to reason that such an attempt would strengthen rather than weaken the hand of Durton and the Union. I apologize for my overly hasty words. Lady Myra smiled at this. There's nothing for which you need to apologize. Your haste is commendable. It is clear merely that you have no experience with matters of a political nature. Valinar nodded. You are right there, my lady. The council meeting of the elves of the forest, with whom I was raised, were very peaceful affairs with arguments about nothing more than about the size of our hunting parties and how many traders to allow within our borders in a given year. And there was little in the way of intrigue. However, the question remains, what are we going to do about this? Before Valinar could complete his sentence, there was a knock at the door. At a signal from the Duke, the guards that were standing near Valinar and Urgar stepped closer and grabbed onto their arms as if they were still prisoners. Only when this is done did the door open. Through the door came a footman bearing the golden trident on field of blue livery of House Durton. He cast a sharp eye upon the two seeming captives before advancing toward the Duke. He bowed stiffly and wordlessly presented the Duke with the parchment he had in his hands, which the Duke took and read quickly. Tell Lord Durton that I will call the council meeting for tomorrow, as he has requested, and that it shall be at midday, snarled the Duke, and the messenger, taking the hint from the harsh tone the Duke had adopted that his welcome was at an end, did a quick about face and hurried from the room as quickly as dignity allowed. Once the door was once more firmly closed, the guards released their hold upon Valinar and Urgar and once more backed away. You are correct in your urgency, Valinar, said the Duke wearily, as he massaged his forehead with his right hand. If Lord Durton has called a council meeting for tomorrow, he is ready to move. So whatever we are going to do, we must do quickly. Father, let me break into Lord Durton's mansion and find this proof we need. It has got to be there somewhere. No, Lord Durton's mansion is too well guarded and no doubt protected by powerful enchantments. It would be suicide, said her father sharply and then more softly. I cannot bear the thought of losing you. If I were to go on my own, I would agree with you, insisted Myra. But if I bring Valinar along, it would be a different matter. Even the best mages of Patrol have no experience with elvish magic. And after what I saw Valinar do last night, they would be no match for him, even if they did. Before we discuss further such a break-in, I recommend we first target, Urgar put in. Whatever proof of a conspiracy there would be, I would expect that if Lord Durton is in any way clever, he would have destroyed any incriminating evidence that he had in his possession once he realized that Myra was onto him. The Union, on the other hand, may still have such evidence in their possession in case they should ever need to depose Durton. Very clever, mused the Duke. Yes, I think you have hit it on the head. Raika is a paranoid man, and so he would not keep such evidence about if there was even the slightest danger of it being found. But knowing Magister Horvath, he would keep a few choice documents handy. Added to that, he no doubt thinks that he is safe behind the tree that joined the Ramalda to the Union, and the troop of Union soldiers under Commander Bavair he has stationed there. That might well present a problem, replied the goblin, his brow furrowing with consternation. I can handle any physical obstacle in our way, as I would be highly surprised if any mechanism of human construction would even approach the ingenuity of such that my people have developed. I am also fully confident that between Valinar, myself, and your daughter that we could deal with any enchantment that the Union might have in place. But I am concerned about those soldiers. Why, interjected Myra testily, I am a good fighter, and the skills that I have seen from Valinar are truly impressive. I have no doubt your skills in battle, my lady, and I have seen what Valinar is capable of, stated Urgar in a calming tone. But his skill is largely based on his speed and agility. While it is certainly enough to deal with guards or even a few soldiers, I have noticed that his actual experience at fighting as with politics is extremely limited. I fear that a well organized force of soldiers could inevitably overwhelm him. If he were to unleash the fullness of his power upon them, he would like as not bring the mansion down around us, which would certainly not serve our purpose. Valinor nodded his assent to this statement. Urgar is correct. Urgar is correct in what he said. Without using some of the more powerful and destructive weavings of area that I am capable of, I would at most be able to take on 2 or 3 trained soldiers at a given time. And depending upon their skills, even that might be taxing on my power and my concentration. If only we could get those soldiers out of the way for even a few minutes. Could you not weave a spell to put the soldiers to sleep? Inquired Myra. Yes, I could, said Valinor, was Valinor's reply, but not in the heat of battle. To put more than one being into slumber is a complex spell and is rather simple to counter or block. We would also not know if some natural enchantment had blocked or lessened the effect, or if some mage in their employ had countered it until we were in the match, and at which point it would be too late to develop a backup plan. Wait a moment, exclaimed Urgar. My lord, did you not say that Lord Durton is a paranoid man? Indeed, replied the Duke, clearly unsure what had gotten the goblin so excited. But that trait is what has made him so dangerous an opponent. Indeed, paranoia is a virtue among those that would play the game of politics, but perhaps that can be turned to our advantage. I assume that Durton has spies and agents of his own among those who claim to serve you. In, Indeed, we root out the ones that are in key positions whenever we can, but we allow a few of the lesser agents to remain in place and attempt to divine when Durton is endeavoring to discover something about us, as well as to sow some disinformation now and again. Would you judge it likely that Durton probably knows that you know that some of his agents have been discovered but not exposed yet? I am sure that Durton does, just as I know that the same situation applies to a few of my agents. It is a game that has been played among us nobles for a great many centuries. At his response, Urgard smiled triumphantly. Exactly. I propose that you arrange for one of Durton's agents, whose duplicity he believes still to be unknown, to discover that you are planning to make a raid upon his mansion tonight, in order to uncover a plot against himself. I also suggest that you covertly make it known to one of his agents whom he knows to be compromised that you are intending to make a raid on the Union Mansion in order to find out what they are up to. The Duke's face was difficult to read as he thought about this proposal, and after a moment he began to nod slowly. I think I see what you are getting at, but please give voice to your thoughts on what you would accomplish. The elf and my daughter seem somewhat puzzled. Urgar smiled knowingly and explained. Durton, being a paranoid man, will take those 2 pieces of information and reach the conclusion that the raid will be on his mansion, and he will almost certainly have destroyed any usable evidence, and paranoia will tell him that he could well have missed something. Or you could let Valinar's abilities at divining truth from the eyes of men slip to that agent as well. And knowing that he does not have the manpower to stop you, should you raid his compound in full force, he will call on his allies, the Union, to give him aid in laying an ambush. Additionally, if you provide information that indicates that Valinor will be leading the raid, they will almost certainly send their entire contingent, because they seem to fear Valinor beyond all scope of what he has actually accomplished. That is a very good plan, Urgar complimented Myra, but the Durton and Union mansions are quite close to one another, and Union will not leave their compound wholly undefended. What few soldiers the Union leaves to guard its mansion should not be too difficult to deal with compared to a full troop, replied Urgar, and even if the alarm is raised immediately, it will not still take the Union soldiers several minutes to return, and that should be all the time we need. With that, turned to look at the Duke for response, as did Myra and Valinor. Duke Patrol mused on what he had just heard for a few moments. His weathered face was once more unreadable and stern, with the only sign of movement being his methodical massaging of his right temple and his sea green eyes slowly moving between his daughter, the goblin and the elf, as if he were sizing each of them up in turn. After several long minutes of this, he at last spoke. "It shall be done as you suggest, Master Goblin, for I can see no other way that this might be achieved, and though I am loath to send my only daughter along, she is the only one I trust in this matter. I shall make the preparations you recommend, and you shall all go with my blessing. I can only hope that you find the proof we need, or we are all in a great deal of trouble." "Thank you, Father," grinned Myra. "I promise that I will be careful." "I thank you for your trust you have placed in me, my lord," said Valinar, bowing graciously. "I shall do everything I can to see that your daughter is returned to you safely." "And I thank you, Lord Duke, for following my counsel, dangerous though it is," added Urgar, bowing deeply. The Duke rose from his chair and bowed stiffly to elf and goblin in turn, and as he moved to leave the council chamber, he turned to Urgar and smiled, saying, "You have a gift for politics and plot, Gaerudar. It is my sincere hope that you will never have cause to turn your cunning upon us." "You are quite cunning yourself, my lord," responded Urgar, "which makes me wonder whether or not you had a plan in case you were unseated as Duke." The Duke paused at the door and turned, his face an unreadable mask. "One cannot plan for everything in politics, my dear goblin, which is why I sent my 2 sons along with the bulk of our army and fleet to the Northern Isles for training, to keep them clear of all these dangers." The goblin nodded knowingly, and with that all present went to make their preparations. All right, I hope you enjoyed the chapter. Again, I would love to hear your thoughts on both the dramatic reading I just did as well as the content of the chapter and the story so far. Please comment below, as well as like, share, subscribe, check out, buy the book, check out my website. All of that is linked below here. And I hope you all have a wonderful day, get a chance to do or experience something creative, and I'll catch you on the next one.